Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us today for the first time from New York City, Ryan Heath, who is the senior editor of Politico and writes the Global Translation blog and podcast. And from Munich, Stefan Kornelius, who is the political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. And from Massachusetts today, Susan Glasser, staff writer from the New Yorker. Thanks so much for joining us for a in-depth look on what the Biden trip to Europe and the summits that we're seeing, a summit at the G7, a summit with NATO, a summit with the European Union, and a summit with Vladimir Putin, all in 7 days. For us foreign policy wonks, it couldn't get any better than that. Ryan, let's start with you. President Biden has made the new bumper sticker is America is back. But the question is, back to do what? What do you see as his aim for the 7-8 days that he's over in Europe?
Absolutely. America is back. That's clear. And it's not just what they do with it. It's for how long. That's the immediate follow-up question that I have. So maybe I'll just address that very briefly. I think there's a lot of allies that are rightly a bit skeptical of what would happen the next time a Republican president landed in the White House. I think some of them use that as an excuse not to dive directly in to some of the messy compromises that Biden would happily engage with them on. So I'm not giving them credit for that suspicion, but I'm saying that it's a real thing that's out there based on the conversations I've had. I think it's also absolutely the case that Emmanuel Macron loved being multilateralist in chief while Donald Trump was in power. Angela Merkel did not mind being the world's liberal safety net. And people who have access to that don't like to give it up so easily just because Joe Biden says he's here and America is back. Joe Biden's aims for this trip are pretty clear. One is to rally a united front amongst democracies. He wants to turn up and deliver a strong show of force in his meeting with Vladimir Putin. And he also wants to show that America's reputation is back on track. That whole point about America is back. So he's doing a lot of clever things. He's sidekicking or kicking down the sidelines some thorny issues like discussion over Nord Stream 2 with Angela Merkel. There's a White House visit that's now been scheduled for July, so they can keep smiling all the way through this next week of summits, for example. I think that he's going to have to deal with some bruised egos in general amongst the EU. The EU likes to start battles on important issues, but they can't necessarily finish them on their own. So there is a little bit of frustration in Brussels that John Kerry gets to bowl up now and take all the credit for climate diplomacy, that Janet Yellen gets to go in there and seal the corporate tax deal when it was the EU that started all these battles with the big tech companies. But Biden has a pretty good chance of getting these messages to land because at the end of the day, democracies are relieved that they have a predictable president, someone that they can trust the word of, let's say, in the White House. But there's a lot of work to do. So I just think that even though America is back, Biden he's got a critical 3 to 6 months ahead of him, really. He's going to have to show that there's momentum for a global climate deal. They really have to come up with a plan about Chinese economic bullying. They're going to have to put even more money down on the table to have an alternative to Belt and Road if being a club of democracies is to mean something.
Susan, I think Ryan laid out a whole menu of goals. If you look at what's happening in Washington and how the trip is seen as Washington is just showing up more than enough to demonstrate that this is a different president. It's a very different kind of way of dealing with the world. Frankly, one that aside from Donald Trump and a few Republicans, most Republicans for many years have been wanting their president to represent a more open way to the world. Or do you think the politics has changed so much in the United States that no matter what Biden does, the Republicans will look at it as too little and too weak, and the Democrats will accept everything that he does? Is the polarization going to affect the way that Washington looks at this trip?
Well, first of all, I think that was a fantastic kind of overview from Ryan on what the actual issues are on the table. But I think the sad reality is that in American politics, not just in Washington, but more broadly, it's the death of substance. And so from the point of view of the politics, you asked me, how does the trip look? What would it constitute success politically? The bar is very low there, it seems to me, for Joe Biden, but for some worrisome reasons, actually. Sure, the bar is low because Donald Trump was a disaster internationally. And even, at least privately, many members of his own party recognize that. For those who are China hawks, for example, they understood that it wasn't exactly in Trump's interest to not have allies on board with him and to be, terrifying the Japanese and the South Koreans at every moment of his presidency, in addition to alienating the Europeans. So, in that sense, politically, it's low risk for Biden, it seems to me. This trip is, it's about getting other world leaders like Boris Johnson, who not so long ago was the Trump of Britain. Let's remember, it's getting Boris Johnson to say, what a refreshing change. And I'm so delighted to have Joe Biden, and everyone else to, hug him and mean it. And so that's not to say, I think Ryan's right that those issues are very real with Merkel, with Macron, and frankly, the frustrations with Europe as a partner long predated the Trump presidency. And it was the Obama administration that really was pressing first on, say, more contributions to defense budgets among the NATO members, for example. It was a stunning speech by Defense Secretary Gates in the Obama era that I remember, that was one of the biggest lectures to Europe from an American leader in recent memory. But, for Biden, the scary fact is that Americans are detached from the reality of the policy process internationally, from foreign policy. They don't care. And to the extent they care, it's being seen through almost a caricaturish, cartoonish lens, certainly on the Republican side with Fox News propaganda that, as you said, Ivo, is going to portray Biden as a failure no matter what he does. So it's kind of irrelevant what he does, unless it's some monumental screw up or monumental success. But I think that Ryan is right to spotlight, like, how far are Europeans really willing to go? And to me, the answer to that is, how much were they scared into a new reality by Donald Trump? Or, like anything, do they think, well, we live with that and we'll just get over it?
Yeah, I guess that's the big question, Stefan, to you. And in some ways, Joe Biden is the most Atlanticist president we've had since George H.W. Bush. He lives and breathes the transatlantic relationship. He is a frequent visitor to the Munich Security Conference, that, what I call the Academy Award of National Security Policy wonks that takes place in Munich in February every year. He's sort of part of that whole culture. But there's a sense that he's also the last Atlanticist. He is 78 years old. We are going to get a new generation of leaders. We already had them before, but we'll have them again in the future. And that leadership didn't grow up in the same way that Biden did. Is this sort of seen as a last hooray as opposed to America's back, or how is Biden seen, and what Biden represents for the future of that relationship that has been so central, particularly in your country, but very frankly, everywhere in Europe for the past 75 years?
Well, first of all, I think Biden is a very fast healer. He's providing both this retrospective view, the nostalgic view, and on the other side, a very harsh, realistic view in the future versus China, versus tech questions, versus Russia. So he's actually confronting the Europeans with both angles. Nevertheless, I wouldn't really underrate the importance of those meetings, which are indeed highly symbolic over the next days. If you look at the communiques, if you look at the substance of the talks, I mean, there is something in it. Yes, I mean, we shouldn't really talk it down on vaccine, on sort of showing the world that the West is leading in providing vaccinations, on tech issues, when there will be the joint technical tech council with the US and the EU will be set up in Brussels on Tuesday. in NATO. But the main message is, hey guys, we're still alive. The past 4 years didn't really kill us. And I think that's an extremely important message. It shouldn't really last for too long. I mean, it will not hold us, keep us for the next 12 months. But it's only 6 months that the American capital was run over, and we were thinking of America losing its democratic values. So all of a sudden, America is back, and that's quite refreshing. It's reassuring, and it's welcome. Now, there's a bit of a hesitation of a lot of Europeans, especially another German chancellor and others, to jump to Joe Biden and embrace him. So listen, you lead, we follow. Just tell us how much we need to pay. That's not going to happen. For that, the swings in American domestic politics simply have been too strong, and there's a lot of distrust on whether this will last or not. So Europe has understood that it really has to build its own weight somehow. But on the other side, given the lessons of Donald Trump, Europe really understood that America is a European power. It's part of our power balance, of our power equation here. It is important to have America kicking European backs to get things done. So the question is, how do you do it? And how do you phrase it? And how far do you go? It's a give and take all the time. And I think Joe Biden is the right guy he sets the tone. He knows Europe pretty well, and it's working for the time being. And we will have to use those 2 years coming to get things going. But don't underestimate, this is an election year in Europe. Germany this September, France almost in less than a year, the new presidency. It's simply not a given that Macron will carry on. He's really challenged from the right wing. Europe is still shaky, and it really hasn't absorbed the loss of Britain yet. I mean, Britain is gone and it's felt. Britain is a minor power. And Boris Johnson was enjoying the moment when he was sitting next to, or being photographed next to Joe Biden and looking at the Atlantic Charter. But that's reminiscing. That's not the real actual weight of Britain. So things are in constant shift, but sort of in a sum, you really have to take the moment as a sign that the West is back. And I think this is really an important first message.
I think that's a very good and important point. It raises the issue that all of you in one way or another have touched, which is Biden's definition of the purpose of doing so as a demonstration that democracies can still deliver for their people in order to win the competition with autocracies. And it's both a domestic message about being able to show that democracy works, which is an important message for the United States, but also for other European countries to send home. But as a result of that it works better than the alternative. And this division, I wonder, Ryan, when you talk to your European sources, how happy people are on the framing of this as a democracy versus autocracy kind of way in which Biden talks about these issues.
There's definitely an audience for it, so I don't want to say that it hasn't landed. But I think, the obvious subtext when we talk about this is China. We've also got Russia and Turkey on Europe's doorstep. So I don't want to eliminate them as factors, but China is what really a lot of this pivots around. And Europe is, I think, quite uncomfortable with the idea of definitively choosing sides. Now, at the end of the day, America is always the preferred and the closer ally, but China is just so big and so interwoven now. And there is a lot of economic potential in dealing with China, all the reasons why the West engaged in the first place, that I don't think there's a consensus to just kind of cut China off and go all in with Joe Biden. That's just not going to happen. I think there's a near consensus that there has to be more reciprocity and more of a fair playing field with China. So there's certainly a receptiveness to the sort of things that Trump and Pompeo and now Biden are saying about China. But I don't think it's ever going to be the case that Europe just completely cuts China off or just follows a US lead. Like Macron's certainly not going to sign up to that. The German car industry is definitely not going to sign up to that. But at the same time, I think that the Biden message of democracy delivering for its constituents, I think that's a very strong message. The EU's felt that for years in trying to demonstrate its relevance to people who felt disconnected from the EU institutions. And I think in deals like the global corporate minimum tax rate at 15%, that's a really clear win where Biden can go back to his people, where any of the other European leaders, maybe not in Ireland, but everyone else can go back to their population and say, look, this is money that we're going to invest in you to build a more cohesive society and keep a modern social safety net. I think that's a clear demonstration that this whole idea of foreign policy that works for the middle class, I think that's a real win. But I think it has to be practical. If you just get into these abstract arguments and force Europe to change sides or choose sides, I don't think that's going to be sustainable.
Stefan, I can jump in here. This is a very important message Ryan just told us. I mean, the kind of unanimity we now see in the G7 in all the issues, apart from the broad democracy theme, is just amazing. We're all of a sudden talking about climate and about environmental issues, and that wouldn't have been the case 5 or even 10 or it's definitely not 20 years ago. The globalized world is not per se sort of the best scenario we can achieve. We're talking about risk, technical risk, digital risk. We are talking about protecting ourselves from losing these critical infrastructures. We are recognizing that we need to slow down in some respects to simply save the middle class and the lower middle class because they're simply overburdened with the kind of speed. You do see the disparity in income. You do see this injustice which is there in terms of distribution of wealth, and we know what kind of danger there will lie in that for the future. Donald Trump wasn't elected just for some weird causes. I mean, there were reasons for it, and this is why I'm so rather optimistic that apart from the democracy issue, the G7 has a very broad portfolio, a very broad array of themes they can build on. Yes, it's disappointing that there wasn't probably enough time to really get that into operative politics right now, but I'm hopeful that will happen.
Susan, it's not just the G7, it's also the leaders of South Korea and Australia and indeed India, the 3 largest Asian democracies, 2 of whom are close American allies. That are in Cornwall today for these meetings, and do you think that Biden has been able to not only convince the allies, as I think Stefan and Ryan were underscoring, but also Americans about the importance of democracies working together to deal with the challenges that we face, China being one, but COVID being another, climate being a third, the economic recovery, which, by the way, the central banks have very closely coordinated, probably the one area of great international success, even in the last during the last administration. Do you think that this is resonating? Because it's clearly what Biden believes, and he talks about it. And it's kind of new. It's not telling the world what to do. It's trying to bring people together to solve common problems that we have with common solutions.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I'd like to say yes, Ivo. Yes, absolutely. Isn't that great? What I think is that Biden is speaking in the United States to his voters, and they like it. And I think he is not speaking to Trump's voters. And, in the abstract, perhaps there's a lot that they could support in this common agenda, but we're not living in an abstract world. And in the world of our political polarization, first of all, to Stefan's point, there might be a shared agenda and a lot of lofty words about climate. We are living in a situation right now where 53% of Republicans in a poll this week said that Donald Trump is currently the, quote, true president of the United States. Okay. So no, I don't think that Joe Biden is going to be convincing a single one of those Republicans, frankly, with his performance. Now, he was elected because there are more Democrats and independents in this country than there are Republicans. He was elected because he is acceptable to a swath, of Republicans in key states that voted for Trump and just couldn't take 4 more years of it. But, the crisis is happening. And frankly, the crisis is inside Europe too. And I'm glad that we got to this discussion of both the political situation in France and Germany, which makes, you all know better than I do, but it strikes me from the outside that it's very unlikely that either Merkel or Macron is going to be willing to make major transformative new agreements with Joe Biden, given that Merkel is on her way out and doing a valedictory tour, which will include a visit to Washington they just announced today. But, both Macron and Merkel don't seem like they're in a position to change fundamentally what, they're willing to bear in terms of their foreign policy. And, Biden, what can he deliver on climate with a 50-50 U.S. Senate?
Politics, my dear, local politics in particular always interferes. But Stefan, it's a good pivot to looking at Europe. Susan's really at points and sort of what Europe wants. Where if you look at the politics in the United States, you've got to worry about the fact that Joe Biden is indeed maybe an interregnum rather than a fundamental pivot in the way America's approaching the world. And so if what do you hear in the Chancellery, in the Elysee, in Italy and even in London about this idea that, we can't count on the United States, and what do we do about it, and how do we make sure that things are happening? Or is domestic politics interfering in the ability for grand policy and strategy?
Well, in France and Germany, definitely domestic politics is in the way of strategically planning for the next 2-3 years. Merkel's impact is already not felt at the summits now anymore. She is on her way out. She cannot deliver anymore on whatever she promises, even if there's a lot of continuity in German foreign politics. And her most likely successor will be Armin Laschet from her own party. So yes, she has a lot to be credited for over the past years, and she was there at a very crucial time for the Western countries. But now it's her time to leave. So Germany will be in limbo, and her successor doesn't have the clout to carry her weight for the next round. And the same applies to France, where every single inch of energy will go into getting Macron re-elected, because he's the only choice, or is the only hope to keep France from turning right wing and actually in the end turning away from the European Union, or possibly even leaving it. And that would be really the final blow to Europe. So that will be the fight to watch for. How does this spill over in concrete politics versus the United States? Well, there is alignment on a couple of issues. Yes, on climate. Let's see how far that can go, Susan. You're right. That might find its natural stop somewhere in Congress. There is alignment on actually seeing Russia. Merkel is long disappointed now in Putin's behavior. She's not really cozying up. We can talk Nord Stream in a second, but I would really want to take Nord Stream as the prime example on how your relation to Russia is. Things have extremely cooled down. What Germany did with Navalny and with the opposition there is quite on another sheet. Now let's check on how that translates in, let's say, conventional arms build-up in Eastern Europe or support, economic support, mostly for Ukraine. And the testing place will be Belarus in September, when the Russians have the big maneuver, and we'll see whether the troops in the end will leave again. And everyone actually fears they will not. On the other players in Europe, there is a bit of change. Look at what's happening to sort of the hard guys in Poland and Hungary, Orban and the Kaczynski Poland, where we do see that pressure from the European Union does work. It's incremental, it's small, it's sort of taking time, but it works. In terms of economic stability, Europe has done its share now after the pandemic. It will catch on. The real testing ground will be China. And this is where the alignment with Biden is most difficult to achieve, because the the twinning of economies is simply stronger, especially with Germany. But from my understanding in my talks, I also do see that there is a growing understanding outside Merkel. And there's a big split in the German government between the Chancellery and the rest on how to see China. And even those within the Chancellery who defend Merkel's sort of appeasing policy towards Xi Jinping do say we need to gain time to give our industry the opportunity to get out of that mess somehow undamaged. There's too much money invested in China. Just look at sort of the American side, Tesla, how that was dealt with in China. The regime is suppressing, and they're doing this in an extremely pseudo way. They're not really being detected as playing foul. But the European Parliament now has really stood up against the current line from the German government, and other countries do as well. So it'll take these elections. It will need to have those elections in Germany to change course. Merkel's time has come to an end somehow. It's weird after 16 years. It's a long stretch, but she has bridged now over the Trump years, and we're at this so far often mentioned inflection point where you have to make a choice. And I think a lot of people in Germany do see that. The foreign community does see it, the intelligence community does see it. It's just the inner circle around Merkel, which is not prepared to make that change now.
Well, that suggests that over time, and in the case of Germany, only over a few months, the possibility of real change with regard to China policy and perhaps a closer alignment. I think my reading of the Biden approach to China is it is different from the Trump approach, in the sense that they understand that there are interlinkages that can't be broken, and that there are ways that you need to work together with China, even as you put very strong stakes in the ground on issues like human rights, on IPR, on technology, and on security. But this decoupling thrust that was really the key of Pompeo and others might be a little less, and therefore allow for a closer alignment between the United States and our friends in Europe. And I would argue our friends in Asia, who are even less likely to follow a decoupling strategy, and yet to have a common voice on those issues. We'll come back to China, I'm sure, in the future. I want to pivot to the country that you just mentioned, Stefan. But there is this final meeting between between Biden and Putin. It kind of weird in some ways when you think about it. America coming back, and the first thing we do is we have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, which sounds a little like yesterday. But it is nevertheless, it's happening, and it's an important meeting. Biden is not interested in a reset. He wants to deal with Russia as it is, not as we would like it to be, I guess. You just wrote a great column on sort of thinking about Russia in your weekly column, Susan. What do you expect Biden will try to do in this meeting, and what do you think will come out of it?
Well, first of all, I think, right, once again, the stakes are defined in a way by what they're not. And so Biden has the easy opportunity to exercise the ghost of Helsinki, in the sense that from an American political point of view, from a global point of view, he gets to be the American leader who doesn't kowtow to Vladimir Putin and actually shows up and says, my goal in showing up is to look Vladimir Putin in the eye and tell him off, and tell him, hey, buddy, you've got to stop the malarkey in Biden terms, right? And so, in that sense, okay, right? But you're right, it's a weird meeting. And there's a lot of, I think, unrest with that among Russia hands, both Democratic and Republican, who think, why give Putin the international recognition and stature and platform that he so obviously craves? Has he purchased this at the price of, making such a threatening moves as to send 100,000 troops to the border with Ukraine? And so, there's a question of, why is the summit taking place in the first place? What's on the agenda? Unlike a normal summit, it's not like there's anything they're really going to do, as far as anybody can tell, that would be concrete and specific. The one very concrete agenda item was taken care of in the very first week more or less, of Biden's tenure, which is the renewal of the New START nuclear treaty, which, I think most people welcomed, but that's already done. So, nobody can articulate a theory. I asked recently a very senior Biden official, tell me, what's your case for this? And this struck me as somebody who was being diplomatic, but was not in favor of this meeting. And the best case that they could muster essentially was, well, we didn't really want to deal too much with Russia, but Vladimir Putin, essentially threatens to, jump out of any box we put him in. And we have decided reluctantly, more or less, that this is the price that we have to pay of a certain amount of high-level attention from Biden himself, from the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, that we need to do this in order to head off or to prevent an even bigger Putin eruption. So that is their theory of the case, such as it is for this meeting. It's low stakes in the sense that nobody really has any high expectations. Biden is the 5th American president that Putin has dealt with. He has confounded all of them. And I'm going to include Trump in that number, since Trump, maybe had different expectations than the others, but clearly would have loved to be able to build Trump Tower in Moscow and, be welcomed with open arms in a way that Vladimir Putin wasn't going to do for him or for anyone. So, low expectations. But I just want to say one other thing, and I'm eager to hear what Ryan and Stefan have to say about this. But from my point of view, stepping back and looking at 20 years of, American presidents trying and failing to come up with a more successful way of dealing with Putin, that obviously extends to Europe as well. And it just seems to me, on both China and Russia, a little bit more humility from the technocratic class is probably in order here. We've been imposing sanctions and sanctions and sanctions, we meaning Western countries, since 2014. And guess what? I know hope springs eternal, but, we're not just one round of sanctions away from Vladimir Putin, changing his stripes at this point, right? And I have not heard any creative policy thinking from any of the European leaders or the Biden administration when it comes to what we're going to do differently. Frankly, I'm shocked that we're not even still talking about this Belarusian essentially hijacking of a European airliner, obviously sanctioned by Putin, who welcomes Lukashenko to a, buddy congratulatory summit in Sochi right after it happens. I mean, this, there's a lot of sanctimony in the quote unquote transatlantic community about the rules-based international order. And guess what? The rules-based international order was flagrantly violated with one of your own airliners. And okay, great. The Europeans got together and had sanctions really quickly on Belarus. As far as I know, they didn't do anything with Russia and have stopped even talking about this. I don't know. I feel that Vladimir Putin is in a pretty strong position internationally, even if he's not in such a great position domestically. Putin this week has banned the major opposition organization in the country. There is less space for freedom of speech and political activism in Russia today than, certainly less than in the late Cold War. You have to go back a very long time in the Soviet history to get to this point. And I just don't hear anybody offering anything very meaningful to say about it.
Wow, Susan, that's a challenge here. I mean, I don't disagree at all. I'm not sure that Ryan or Stefan disagrees, but it is a challenge. It's a challenge. How do we deal with this guy? The normal way of dealing is we get together, we call and get him on the phone, what Merkel does frequently, and I guess Biden has his meeting, but it doesn't change anything in terms of he seems to be getting away with it. Ryan, how do the Europeans that you talk to and the folks here in the United States, do they offer a better solution? Is there a different strategy that can actually start to deal with Putin as the disruptor in chief and figuring out? I mean, he's disrupting our elections. He's disrupting our economic system. How are people reading this?
I want to tell you there are better solutions at the ready than there really are. But one of the discussions I had in the last week was with Estonia's chief cyber diplomat. And I think this is at the margins of what can be done. This is not attacking Putin's power head on, but Estonia has been working very hard to try and have the application of international law into cyberspace to establish more norms and rules of the road about what can and can't be targeted, and to better understand the distinctions and the overlaps between sort of just rank cyber criminals, state-sanctioned cyber terrorism, and the fact that it's a very closely drawn Venn diagram between the two of them when it comes to Russia. So there's not unthoughtful things going on, but I just don't think they're the core things that change the relationship or change Putin. You know, were it up to me, I would be telling you to go after the dirty money. Kleptocracy is a big problem. Maybe that doesn't tackle Putin directly, but that is certainly going to be disruptive back from the West if more were done to really clamp down and stop the flow of dirty money. And then the EU's probably played its best card already and decided it doesn't want to play any more of that card, which is bringing people into the club. The EU tomorrow could say that Ukraine should be a member of the European Union. It's absolutely not going to do that, but we shouldn't pretend that that is not a strategy the EU could choose. And there's a lot of reasons why they're not choosing it, but you know, that's the best thing the EU can offer a lot of the time.
Stefan, you're right when you mentioned that Merkel has truly soured on Vladimir Putin. It's been a long process. She's in some ways been the most realistic European leader for quite some time on Russia, and yet there is the traditional playbook, whether it's on Nord Stream or on getting on the phone and saying you can't do that. Do you think with a change of government that might change in Germany, that too, just as you talked about China, that there may be some greater willingness to put economic, political pressure on Putin and his regime?
A remarkable level of understanding for Russia and Putin in the German public, which I find just stunning. Nevertheless, I think we only have a certain amount of influence on what we can do now within Russia. We can increase sanctions. We can do whatever we want. It's a country which is actually stabilized by the kind of pressure we apply from the outside. It's like the North Korean Kim strategy. You bunker in and you tease. You really you beg for attention by breaking rules, by shooting missiles, by doing whatever you want, and then you get your attention. And that's what's happening next week in Geneva. And it's basically the oxygen Putin needs, which he lives from. And he turns around, goes back to Moscow and says, oh, listen, I got the president of the United States and we talk eye to eye, and this is how important I am, and don't even think touching me. And so we are sort of caught here in a vicious cycle. I'm not sure how to break it. We can increase the sanction regime. We can sort of cut off all economic ties. Danger is that Russia will collapse internally and will be thrown into China's arms, which is not a desired outcome either. We can, I don't think we can sort of bring in Ukraine as a member or give sort of a higher status in the EU, closer to the European Union, because this would actually even harm the EU, because the Ukraine is not such a sort of role model of democracy either, and there is quite a sort of a high level of demand before you choose to join the club. So what we can do is what Ryan said: increase the higher defense around Russia with international norms, with cyber legislation. Let's think about a more systematic approach on the energy level. Cutting off one pipeline and leaving all the other 4 or 5 pipelines untouched will not change a thing. Let's have a look at the impact on the energy pricing schemes. I think we need to be a little bit more mobile in thinking about how to deal with Russia. We lost totally the way to understand how this country ticks. They shielded themselves off, and the kind of dialogue has ended. I'm not seeing what will come out of Geneva, except from the realization that we're at a dead end here. Putin will definitely not turn around and say, "Oh, sorry, I got this wrong, and let's do some arms control talks." And oh, sorry, I sent you Navalny. That's not happening. And he has basically killed opposition yesterday. There is, until now, he has just kept them under control, and now he's killing them. He's taking them out. And the only hope I do have is that the still existing and living Russia opposition and civil society will stand up to this. We saw that happening before, and the next chance we will have to see it, might see it, will be September after the Duma elections.
Susan, to you the last word. You know Russia better than many of us, having lived and reported from there for so many years, and written a great book on Russia under Putin. Do you think that it is going to be solved internally, as George Kennan in the end said with the Soviet Union, that something will happen that maybe pressured from the outside, but that something will happen that will change the direction of Russia in a fundamental way? Or do we just have to live with a Russia that is going to continue to be there and disrupt, because disruption is its strength? That's how it gains attention and strength, in the way that Putin has perfected in some ways.
Yeah, I think Stefan put it well. That this is the pattern that we're trapped in. And after 20 years in power, well, the Soviet Union lasted for 70 years. So Putinism has lasted for 20 years, and he's still young. He's only in his late 60s. He's changed the constitution to extend his tenure in power. And I don't see any meaningful change as long as he remains in power when it comes to this pattern of Russian foreign policy, and as a way out. That, by the way, that is a historical pattern that predates Vladimir Putin and predates the Soviet Union, is this idea of Russian leaders justifying autocracy at home and papering over its problems by engaging in conflicts outside of its borders. That's a very long historical pattern for the Russians. And I think we tend to overly personalize and dramatize things in this era, and the way that we have narratives about, what kind of relationship are Biden and Putin going to have? What does it mean to have them look eye to eye? I think that's the wrong set of questions. And, really it's now become this issue of, if it's a dead end, as I agree that it is, Stefan, what, if anything, is going to be the conclusion that President Biden and the new leader of Germany, whoever that's going to be, and President Macron or his successor, what are they going to fundamentally do about this dead end, especially at a moment when they want to focus on China. So people should probably lower their expectations for next week, and I guess, make some popcorn and watch the show.
Well, that's what we're all going to do. We're going to be watching the G7, the NATO summit, the US EU summit, and the Putin Biden summit. By that time, we'll all be summited out, I'm sure. We'll be back, though, to analyze all of this, not next week, because we're taking the week off for Juneteenth, but the week after, to analyze everything in World Review. In the meantime, please join me in thanking Ryan Heath of Politico, Stefan Kornelius of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and Susan Glasser of the New Yorker for your insights about what's happening in Europe this week. As always, this was World Review, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.